welcome to another episode of Slator Pod, this time from Zurich and from a undisclosed location in the French Alps. Is that right, Esther?
Yeah, I'm in Morzine skiing, so yeah, there we go.
Okay, great. Yeah, we managed to figure out the Wi-Fi issue for the call, and also this time the audio should be significantly better than last time around on my side. There was an issue with the microphone, but we're learning as we go along. Mm-hmm. Well, today we're going to talk a bit about your trip to Canada last week and how that conference went. Then we're going to talk about Corona. It's the topic of the week, of the month, probably of the year. So we're going to talk a little bit about how this is impacting the LSPs, the translators, the interpreters. And then there was a survey published in China at the end of February, which we're going to look into in a bit more detail. Then we're also going to run through the fastest growing LSPs last year. We published a list this week that kind of sliced and diced our language service provider index by growth, and there's some interesting results there. And then we're going to talk about a very funny call for proposals out of the Department of Homeland Security in the US, where they're basically looking for a magic interpreting device. Don't want to be too snarky here, but it was funny when we came across this, and it was we'll look into that. So first, tell us a bit about your trip to Canada and how that conference was.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a very quick stopover in Canada. So I think I turned around in about 24 hours. But yeah, I was there for the AILIA rendezvous, which I think is an annual gathering by the Association of Canada. So really interesting gathering, about 100 participants or so, really from across the spectrum of the language industry. So obviously some Canada-based LSPs were there, OXO Translations I met there, a couple of others as well. Lionbridge and STL were also there. And then some sort of freelancers as well, and people across the sort of TMS spectrum, so MemoQ, PluNet, really, really broad attendance, actually. And there was also one of the second talks of the morning was from the Canada Translation Bureau, so the kind of government arm of, the translation. They're in charge of all the sort of French and English translations and more coming from the government. So a big buyer of translation services and I think responsible for an enormous amount of the actual overall spend in Canada, they were saying. So that was a very interesting talk in the morning as well. But generally, really well attended across the spectrum. And it was actually the occasion where the outgoing president of AILIA, Sharon Steinberg, handed over to the incoming president, which is Robin Ayoub from Lionbridge.
Yeah, I know Robin. We go back probably 10 years. Because he was the head of sales, VP of sales for a company that the company I worked for previously, CLS Communication, acquired. So he was sales at Lexitech, and then it was acquired by CLS, and then CLS was acquired by Lionbridge. Fantastic guy, Robin. One of the best sales people I've ever met, and he's now the general manager for Lionbridge Canada.
Canada, yeah.
Right. Yeah. Now is the president of AILIA now.
I had a very similar experience. I met somebody who was working for SDL, Martin Auger, who was previously working, I believe, for Multicorpora, which was acquired by Donnelly, which was then acquired by SDL. So when I was working for Donnelly, we were working in the same company. So small industry.
Small industry. Multicorpora was that's the TMS though, right?
Yeah. So it was based in Canada. So it was very, very much sort of Canada based. Did a lot of government work as well at the time.
I might have met him at a Lock World in 2015 or even end of 2014 when I was still running around with like a kind of a sketch of what Slator was supposed to be. I remember that also with Somebody from Donnelly there. Interesting. So great. Yeah, a good conference. I'm glad you made it back without too many delays, right?
Yeah, all fine.
Okay, all fine.
And then
great.
straight over to straight over to Geneva for skiing. So yeah.
So segueing into our next topic, did you see, was the plane full or barely full or empty or?
Both were, pretty full. No sort of obvious emptiness. People obviously wearing face masks and what have you at the airports. Some people taking those kind of precautions. Yeah. Yeah,
it's a pretty big impact, obviously, and they canceled 3 conferences this week. This month. They canceled or postponed rather. Sorry, I should be very precise here. They postponed Gala, Taos, and XTM Live. So I was supposed to go to XTM Live, but it's postponed. And we're going to do a virtual conference instead in 2 weeks, and more details will be announced. It's an interesting experiment that's going on, of course, at the moment. And as we're also disclosing in our newsletter today, we're definitely watching this with a view to SlatorCon London in early May, as I outlined last time. It's 8 weeks, so we're going to have to monitor this for another week or two, and then see how we proceed. For now, the conference is still proceeding as planned. And this week we've seen the first few tweets also and posts from coming out of the language industry. So I think about the impact mostly from the interpreter side. So it's maybe just briefly discuss how this is going to impact this industry. So first, I did check around the performance of the listed LSPs, because that is an indicator of how the broader market would perceive this industry to perform during a crisis like this.
Sure.
And it's not bad, in fact. It's definitely outperforming the broader market. I mean, if you're looking at SDL, if you're looking at RWS, shares are down, but they're not as much down as the overall market. So that is interesting. And then if you're looking at companies like Teleperformance, the owner of LanguageWire, which is, a remote, basically...
Language Line, yeah.
Language Line, yes, apologies, Language Line. I mean, it's probably 99% remote work. Those shares barely budged. So it's, basically the market seems to, for now, assess that this industry is going to go through this, fine for now. So it's interesting. Obviously, there's all these individual stakeholders in the industry. And if you're looking at, breaking it down into like freelance translators, freelance interpreters, and the corporates, the LSPs, as a freelance translator, mostly, probably almost exclusively, you're working remote. So the impact there would be operationally, I would assess it to be fairly minimal. As long as you're getting the work from your clients, there's probably very little you have to do. You're at home or you're in your office, and you're working mostly remote. So then it just depends what's your specialty and how your sector is performing. If you're in travel and retail or others, maybe there may be some work drying up from your clients, but operationally, I would assess you're fine. What we've seen on Twitter is that the conference interpreters are obviously being disrupted by this in the markets that are heavily affected. There was some tweets going back and forth around Italy and how this has basically shut down the market or conferencing more broadly in Italy, and that this is affecting conference interpreters who are now beginning to look for translation work just to fill that time. And then there's the discussion around independent contractors, and because if you're full-time employed, you have a certain security. If you're an independent contractor, if the government shuts down events, then what are you going to do? They're not going to compensate you for it. So there's that component. For the LSPs, I did mention how the shares performed. Again, operationally, I think the language industry is extremely well set up to weather this storm, because it's by default mostly remote, right? I mean, most of the very large, medium-sized and smaller players rely on a remote workforce already. So, there's obviously, you have the PMs, project managers, the Salesforce that are going to the office, and certain translators, but it's very easy to switch to a remote, or easy, I mean, within bounds, right? It's easy-ish to go to a fully remote setup, which many companies are now doing. In terms of the
We
verticals,
do have a few contact.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was
Cool.
going to jump in and say, I mean, I know that we do have some kind of contact center type LSP set up, don't we? So if you think about the large interpreting ones, potentially there's a ton of interpreters over the phone sitting in one or two or three big call centers. So that
You're
would
right.
be
Yeah.
maybe
Yeah, that would
harder
be-
operationally to make remote.
That's right. Yes. That's you're right. That's operationally hard in terms of demand. I would expect this to pick up as the healthcare system is really coming under a lot of stress. So if you're in healthcare interpreting from a remote point of view, you're probably not experiencing any shortage of work over the next few months. And in terms of the more written translation providers, I think travel, retail, hotels, airlines, anything like that, obviously is going to be a very tough sector over the next few months until this ends. I would expect pharma, regulatory, government, anything like that would, unlikely to have experienced a dramatic slowdown for now. Obviously, always in the context of this being more of a short-term impact, but of course, if the broader economy weakens significantly, then everybody's going to suffer eventually. So, but it's way too early to tell. What's interesting, we have the Alexander Drexel from the Troublesome Turp podcast, and he's a conference interpreter. He tweeted a super interesting survey that came out of China. It was published at the end of February, where a group of researchers and professors from 3 universities in China actually surveyed 113 LSPs about what's their impact. And of course, China was extremely hard hit, and China was essentially shut down. Hubei province, Wuhan, but also other regions. So just let me go through some of the main findings there. So they surveyed 113, or that was the response they got. Broad mix from small to large to over 200 staff. So basically, they said they moved fully towards remote. Most kept the businesses open, so 90% of the companies resumed work through telecommuting. Through basically remote work. But also they said that nearly half now have started to work on site again. So, gives us a sense of how generally China is getting back to work. Very, very few have actually suspended the business completely. Again, because the telecommuting aspect is quite, the business lends itself to that. But there's worry. About 80% of those who participated said they worry about a decline in revenue and performance generally this year. And some reported, short-term cash flow issues and just a general dip, quite a strong dip in revenue. Obviously, the areas most hit, one of them is on-site interpreting, which is probably trending towards, not zero, but I don't know, very, very low. And some PR and marketing work has dried up a lot. That's what they said. But what's interesting, they closed, or what's nice, they closed on a quote that says, "This epidemic will eventually end and things will get back to normal, just as the winter has gone and the winter jasmine are in full bloom." So we're seeing the initial, lovely.
Bit of optimism at the end.
Bit of optimism right there. So I've been in touch with the professor, so we're likely going to write a short summary of the report next week. And for those who want to access it now, just check out our Twitter feed. We retweeted it, so you can download it there. Great. So some hindsight. Top 20 fastest growing LSPs. That was in the good old days before the virus. And
in 2019,
in 2019, the good old days. So growth was really strong. Maybe you can say a few words about, if you have it in front of you, about some of the top performers there, and then let's just discuss what drove their performance and go through that list.
Yeah, so I think we mentioned some of these in previous weeks as well when we were discussing the LSPI in a bit more detail. But in terms of growth rates, the company that topped the list was Media Group. And they also made their way into the top 10 by revenue. for the first time in 2019. Followed up by Stratus Video, so the US-based video interpreting provider. And third, in terms of growth rate, I mean, and actually the difference here, it seems to be quite. So we're now at sort of an 80% growth rate on number 3. So Summer Lingua Technologies grew 80% in 2019. Still a very, very good growth rate. But the top, IUNO, came in at, I think, just over or a little over 200% growth across 2019. So rundown for the top 3 is IUNO, Stratus, Summer Lingua, and then another media localizer called Dubbing Brothers, and number 5 is Language Wire.
And
so that's the top 5 by growth.
Top 5, yeah, and 4 out of 5 here are driven by M&A, right? So we're not going to go through the whole list because we spoke about it last time at length, but much of this growth is driven by M&A, and we would estimate the kind of underlying organic growth last year was probably in the 5 to 6 to 7% range. But since this remains a somewhat fragmented market, there's just so much room for these companies buying each other up, and that's obviously driving their top line revenue, right? One note there was, I don't think the big word made it into this one.
Not by the looks of it, no, not at the top 20.
Not at the top 20, but they did put in a very strong performance. Their results are now available. They gave us their figures for the fall 2019, but their official accounts were out now, and they have a nice growth there based on their organic growth based on some of the new government accounts they won. So yeah, it's definitely an interesting ranking to look at. You're seeing which areas are growing, and really the overarching theme is that most of this growth is coming from the merger and acquisition. These large or medium-sized companies are just getting larger by buying up other players. So we shall see how this is going to play out in 2020. Definitely on the organic side, I would expect a slowdown if the current situation persists, and then. Let's see if there's still so much funding available to these companies to acquire. And that's going to be something we're going to have to look at how this plays out over the next few months. There's probably the travel restrictions may actually slow down deal making to some degree. If you're going to acquire a company, you're probably going to want to visit the executives and visit the offices. So if there's major travel disruption, this is going to get slowed down by this as well, right? So whereas the business itself can be done virtually, not the deal making part of acquiring is pretty on site in the end. So a very interesting / funny story we covered this week when the U.S. Department of Homeland Security was tendering out I can only describe it as like a magic interpreting device, or the development of a magic interpreting / translation
What are
device.
they looking for?
This is the second time we had a similar story about 4 years ago with the prison system in the U.S. and this time as well. So what they're looking for is an interpreting device of like a quite a small size, right? That they can bring on to the boats, the ships that are patrolling the coast, and that are waterproof, work in super hot and cold weather, work offline, allow two-way communication. Remember our little Google interpreting experience? So this is fully two ways, and quote-unquote translates into 16 languages, including, Haitian Creole, Ukrainian, and Vietnamese, and then some others that are a bit more high resource. I could go on. There's about 20 bullet points that, it must contain the right of approach and standardized boarding team phraseology. So you're going to have to, this offline device needs to be, target.
Pretty well trained.
Pretty well trained. It needs to translate clearly at a safe minimum distance of 3 to 5 feet from the intended target of conversation. So imagine you're on a ship
Yeah.
there's waves, there's wind, there's noise, and then somebody's standing 3 to 5 feet from you, and it needs to be able to capture that individual's voice and then obviously translate in a two-way approach. Minimum battery life of 12 hours. It needs to record audio, video, and provide transcription. And then I could just go on. Actually, have the ability to float.
Ooh, okay.
So if it falls into the water, you can pick it up again.
You can recover it, yeah.
All right, so the kicker, all of this for a grand total of maximum $800,000.
So not right, okay. Not a ton of money then.
Not a ton of money. And actually that's the max. So like there's like 4 stages, and they're hoping to get, I guess the minimum would be $200,000. So it was there was an interesting comment on LinkedIn when I posted this by John Tinsley from Iconic Translation Machines, the MT company. He's like, the European Union would fund just the development of a corpus for some of these languages with that amount of money. Right, so obviously not the hardware development or anything around it,
but the data.
The data, yeah. So we shall see how this is going to play out. I definitely want to continue to look at how this RFP, continues, and if anybody will even try to submit something, seems kind of unlikely. Now. This is not about making fun of this RFP more broadly, but it's about also that I think the overarching theme here is that the buzz over the past few years around, AI and machine learning and, natural language processing and MT more narrowly has led to people's expectations being really inflated. I mean, if, these people have sat down, they drafted this, so clearly they must have extremely inflated expectations of what is possible today, like that they would sit down and actually scope this out, right? Because this is not possible for now. I mean, we added a note at the end of the article that if anybody feels they can do this, please send us an email, but I doubt anybody will. So in a broader sense, this just shows how the public or people that are not really deeply embedded in this industry now perceive some of these technologies what's the current state of the art. So
well, it'd be interesting to see as well if they are willing to make any concessions, whether some of those requirements are actually nice to haves as opposed to super essential for their purposes.
But ability to float, waterproof, functions offline, record audio, provides. They'd have to get rid of like 90% of those bullet points to get to a point where something kind of feasible.
Yeah. Well, an iPhone's waterproof. Stick it in a.
Does it float?
Buy a ton of iPhones.
Does it float?
I don't believe so. I do not believe so. No.
Yeah.
It does if you attach a float to it.
And then imagine that translate clearly at a safe minimum distance of 3 to 5 feet. That's quite far.
Yeah, it is. It's
quite far, and then the person needs to.
The
person needs to understand you and talk, and the device needs to capture it from that distance. That seems very, very challenging. In a noisy environment, like somebody stands 5 feet from you, and then the device captures it and does a two-way interpreting. What is it supposed to replace? It's supposed to replace what they call unseen translators. So currently they're taking translators onto the ships, onto the boats to do this job. And they also have they set some signals, like some cards that they're holding up. So that is what this is supposed to replace. So I doubt that this is going to go very far. But interesting story. Check it out.
Well, let's see.
There. All right. Well, that's it for today. And hope you tune in next week again. Thanks a lot, Esther.
Thanks, Ryan. Bye.